I watched Last Action Hero this weekend. Have you ever seen that?
Oh, the it's like Arnold Schwarzenegger, right?
It
Yeah,
sure
I
is.
I think when I was like 12, I was like obsessed with that movie.
Really? It's one I missed for some reason, but there was this Reddit thread going around of like the best Arnold movies, and I just realized like I just love basically all of them. Like, but I had missed that one, so I watched it and it was great. I loved it.
Maybe it wasn't that one. Maybe there was one. I'm trying to remember, like True Lies or something.
True Lies is
Is
awesome.
that the
I got
one?
to
There's like
rewatch that
this
one.
like F-16 that like floats up above a
Yeah, I
bridge.
think
I
so.
I
Yeah,
just
yeah,
okay.
yeah,
I'm getting those two confused.
yeah.
That's the one I was thinking of. Okay. Anyway, maybe I
And then
haven't.
I watched Running Man last week, which was good.
Nice.
When he kills the guy with the ice, he's like the big Asian dude. He was like in all of these, like he was in like Karate Kid, and he was like the bad guy in all those like 90s 2000s movies. It's like just a very distinguished looking guy. He looks like freaking who's like the ruler, who was like the
Genghis Khan.
I'm like, yes, it looks like him. And he's like on ice skates, and his like weapon is like a hockey blade that's like a scythe, and he like cuts people in half. His name is Sub Zero, and like Arnie kills him, and then he's like, Sub Zero, more like plain zero. Just like the cheesiest lines ever, but it's so good.
I could just
Last Action
imagine you.
Hero.
I can imagine you in your apartment just scream, like losing your
Oh,
mind at
I
this.
was dying, dude. I was having the best time ever. But Last Action Hero is like Arnold Schwarzenegger is Arnold Schwarzenegger as like an action hero. And the kid's watching the movie, and then he gets a magic ticket and he goes into the movie. And it's actually like a really cool, it's actually pretty creative. It's like I know that Arnold isn't like the most nuanced actor in all of Hollywood, but like his movies actually end up having pretty good plots. Like if you think of Total Recall, and there's a lot of like compelling plot lines to his action to his movies, but this one was pretty good
Dude,
too.
he's been making movies forever. Like anyone that
Yeah,
makes movies that long is good. You know what I mean? Like you can't
yeah,
just be bad and continuously
all
get
right,
jobs and make that many movies. So yeah.
yeah. No, he's amazing. I do think he's been snuffed for an Oscar for too long. But anyways, the Last Action Hero, it was cool. The kid goes into the movie, and then he realizes it's like he gets a ticket from Merlin, and he can like go through, or not Merlin, who's like the magician who can escape, starts with like an H or something.
Houdini.
Yeah, that's it.
Well,
And
I'm just completing all your.
yeah, yeah. I know. I worked out this morning, and my brain is still recovering. But he goes into the movie theater, and then they can kind of like go in between movies, which is kind of a fun little conceit of the film.
Huh.
But anyways, always makes me want to be healthy and work out whenever I see Arnie on the big screen. Good time. Cool, man. So we had a week off. You were out in Vegas at the World Series of Poker. You had a good time there, and
Greatest
I've
city
been
in the
holding
world.
down.
It really is. I mean, it's a
You had
city.
a daughter, though. Would you want her to say that?
Probably not. It is a city that is it is built in the middle of nowhere. It's just built in a desert, and it just shows like what humans can do, what mankind can do. And then what do we do when we build a city in the middle of a desert? We just make it a party city. We fill it with
Yeah.
casinos and just people fly in from all over the world for the weekend to party there. And
Yeah.
yeah, it's everything that's great about humanity. By the way, when I'm there, like I don't drink anything, I don't party, but I just
Yeah,
love
right.
observing it and watching it. It's just yeah, I think it's
That's
like
fun.
just shows off humanity.
That's fun. That's fun. You actually are good. I turn into a piece of human garbage when I go to Vegas, but I have a good time with it. But yeah, the pinnacle of human innovation is just how can we turn into degenerates for 3 days and then
Yep.
come back and want to do it again in a couple of years? It is a lot of fun though. I love eating out. Love all the good food there. It was fun going to React Comp there. But anyways, we're back in action this week, and we want to continue our conversation from 2 weeks ago now. So we had that fun conversation about Ryan's talk, and we wanted to basically finish that up. And originally, we were going to talk about my talk as well. So that's kind of what we wanted to do today. So this is my conference talk from Big Sky, which was now, I guess, a little over a month ago. And last time we talked about Ryan's point about product benefit and technical costs, and we had that whole conversation. And I think it was a good one. I don't know if you actually listened to it again, but I listened to it again, while I was editing it, and it was just like I like that we have that kind of in our catalog, because that's going to be something we can reference a lot, and I think it's going to keep happening. People are going to just you know.
By the way, we're talking about Ryan Florence's Big Sky Dev talk, DevConf, right?
Yep.
That's what's called, Big Sky
Yes.
DevConf. Okay.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Yep.
BigSkyDevCon, I guess. It was called Mind the Gap was the name of his talk.
Yeah, if you missed that episode last week, great talk, and you can go watch it.
Yep. And the gist there was that, a lot of times in the conversations we have, people conflate the benefits, the product benefits, with the technical cost of building a feature. And basically the conclusion that we came to last time was that just because you're using something like a React framework that makes it easy to build a dropdown doesn't mean you should, or it doesn't mean that React is saying more dropdowns or more animations are going to make your product better. So that was kind of the takeaway. And my talk, which came after his at the conference, I was glad that he did that, because his was kind of arguing at the end for how RSCs, React Server Components, are trying to lower that cost. Remember, we talked about the border radius, and the whole idea was like the use client lowered the cost of adding client interactivity. Again, not to say that more client interactivity is better, just for all else equal, given that you want to build that. This is like an interesting idea. And so he was kind of like just showing off this idea, the approach that React Server Components is taking, as a way to just be thought-provoking, even if you're not in the React community. My talk was called High Floor, High Ceiling. And the idea behind my talk was I wanted to step back from any particular approach, whether it was something like React Server Components on the front end with React, or something like Live View with Phoenix, or HTMX, which kind of works with a lot of server-first frameworks, and just take a look at what I think the front-end community's strengths are and what the back-end communities can learn from them, and vice versa. So that's what I want to talk about today. And the idea behind the name of the talk, High Floor, High Ceiling, is a lot of the back-end first frameworks like Laravel and Rails give us a high floor, meaning that the barrier to entry for basically you start off on the 20th floor, right? It's like a low barrier to entry to like starting off on the 20th floor. So I call that a high floor framework, because, when I started Rails, I could build like a complete app without knowing much about what's going on, because there is a cohesion to everything, all the parts of the backend stack. But sometimes you hit a ceiling in the UI in terms of you want to do something more rich or more, interactive on the client, and those frameworks don't have answers. And so you have to kind of step outside of them. Whereas front-end frameworks have the opposite problem, where they have a high ceiling. You can do anything you want in the browser, but usually the floor has kind of dropped out from under you, and you're starting out building on the first floor, which means you have to piece together a lot of those pieces. So that's kind of the gist of it. Does that make sense, kind of to kick us off?
Yeah, that was great. I would say for the backend framework, I also just add, you said that the ceiling is limited, but I think maybe it's fair to say the entire framework, everything is limited. You start off on a really high floor, but I think those constraints, which by the way, I am in the camp that those constraints are good, but I think they limit not just the UI. It's hard to switch databases. It's hard to switch a whole bunch of things, but I would argue that that's a good thing. But anyway, continue.
That's an interesting point. Maybe we can talk more about that in a little bit, but it kind of makes me think of like, times we've worked together and you've had, like a Rails app, and then you have had people have run into scaling issues, let's say, and they have to kind of end up redoing a lot of things themselves. And you have to break out because you hit that ceiling. And like you're saying, for most people, actually, the ceiling is not going to be relevant. And it's easy for us as programmers to want something to imagine that the ceiling is we're going to hit that really soon. So we need more power and control and flexibility, when in reality, that's just going to end up costing a lot more.
Yeah. I do. I've worked on some really, really big Rails apps, and there's only one that I ever worked on that face scaling issues. It was it was TED.com. It was a huge website. It wasn't some startup or product company. So yeah, anyway.
Yep. Great little tidbit there. So let me just kind of skip. That's kind of the first part of the talk, and I'll link to it, but just explain this high floor, high ceiling and the problem. But I want to spend most of this time talking about kind of the benefit, like the strengths of each community, because basically, how can front-end communities raise the floor and how can back-end communities raise the ceiling? That was kind of like the second half of the talk, which is like, I think, the main point of the reason I gave the talk. Because it's not really like arguing for which approach is better or best. It's more like we all have many reasons for using different technologies and different approaches. And people are going to continue working on in their own communities, because Rails people like working in Rails. They're not going to change it just because React Server components came out, and vice versa, right? But I think there's a lot we can all learn from each other. And so the thing that I started with about is the backend and that high floor, and how do you get a high floor? And basically the main thing I pointed out was it kind of falls under the umbrella of cohesion. I think the biggest strength that these backend frameworks have is cohesion that the front-end frameworks don't. And there's no reason that front-end frameworks can't be more cohesive without giving up the freedom for the ceiling that they love and the composition and kind of like a lot of the reasons they went there in the first place.
Can you give an example of the cohesion?
Yes. Yeah. So cohesion is basically what I do is I start showing examples from the Rails docs. And it starts with things like modeling your data. You know, they have an ORM. And again, it's not about whether you use an ORM or like a query builder. It's more about that they have an ORM that they have like an adapter for. And they also have like a mailer that they have an adapter for. And they have a job queue that they have an adapter for. And so right from the guides, in the Rails guides, they can show you signing up for a new user, creating a mailer for that user ID and performing it later in the job queue so that you can respond to the HTTP request and schedule an email, a welcome message to be sent out. And the welcome message doesn't need to block the request and the response, which is usually how you do things like emails that should be in job queues. And so there's this action, there's this, what is it called? Active job. And it knows about the mailer, and the mailer knows about the user from the ORM. And so the code snippet just lets you basically send a welcome email to like the user object and schedules it later. And so it's a very cohesive line of code that's doing a lot of things. Moreover, you can write a test that makes sure that when a user signs up, we enqueue an email, and the correct user that was created in our database, their first name ends up in the body of the email, and I can write a test that asserts against that. And I wanted to show that off because I think a lot of people who work primarily in front-end first frameworks have maybe never seen that level of cohesion before, of all of these pieces working together. I mean, there's like 4 or 5 different components of the architecture that have to comprehend each other for all of that story to work. And that's kind of the cohesion that I'm talking about.
Mm-hmm. That's a great example. Great, beautiful example.
Yeah. So, you know, one of the things about this is if you listen to someone like Taylor from who works on Laravel, or DHH who works on Rails, is a level of opinions that you need to make. You have to kind of put a stake in the ground about how we're going to do things if you want to achieve this level of cohesion. And you know, DHH, we've talked about this before, but DHH went on many years of talking at the beginning of Rails when it came out 20 years ago.
Yeah, 20 years ago? It was like 2000.
Yeah, 2004, 2003.
I think it was 2004. It got popular in like 2007.
Yeah. You know, it was very, against the grain at the time to have a lot of opinions in something like a web framework. And in particular, I remember a lot of years of his conference talks being dedicated to convincing DBAs, database administrators, that it doesn't actually matter how, what we name our database columns, whether it's user ID, user underscore ID, the foreign keys, the name. Lots of people have lots of opinions about that. And his whole point in a lot of this early proselytizing of Rails and trying to get us up to a higher floor and identifying the ways that we are actually not that different. And if we could just make an assumption and the framework could put a stake in the ground, then we can start and not spend time rebuilding all this stuff. He said it doesn't matter, right? It doesn't actually matter. It's like the definition of bike shedding. People love arguing about the color of the bike shed, and it doesn't actually matter for what we're trying to do. And he said, well, if we can just agree to call it, have a foreign key, call it user underscore ID, then look at what we get from this. Like, look at how our mailer and our job system can traverse our relationships instead of you having to even think how you're going to get data from your backend to your mails, right? So that was a big part of it. And again, if you listen to Taylor, who's written Laravel, and Laravel is a very high floor, batteries include as a cohesive framework, he says a lot of the same things. And so I wanted to point this out in the talk because I think a lot of the leaders of front-end frameworks have been scared or hesitant to put that stake in the ground. They've avoided it because they're worried maybe the reason people left those back-end frameworks for more flexibility in the first place is like, I'm not really sure. But there's just been a general avoidance of embracing this kind of like more opinionated version of a front-end framework, more convention over configuration, and understanding like the benefits, the cohesion that can bring, and letting front-end developers just start off on a higher floor and not having to make a decision. How am I going to save my data? How is my data going to send data from my database to my mail system and my auth? How are they going to know if it's authenticated? How am I going to write a test? You're not going to write a test against all that. So that was kind of the cohesion point.
I have a question here on specifically on like the JavaScript side framework here. Have you ever heard of Paul Graham has talked about this idea of tar pit ideas. Have you heard this?
I think you told this to me one time, but I forget what it is.
So like tar pit ideas are like startup ideas that are obvious, but they don't exist. So I think an example he recently gave is like, why isn't there a way for you, like a marketplace for you to like buy and resell like restaurant reservations in New York? And it seems like an obvious thing. Like there's people that just that night want to go to a restaurant and they'll pay a lot of money. Like, shouldn't there be a marketplace where someone that has a reservation can be like, oh, I'll sell this for $1,000 or whatever. Anyway, he says it's a tar pit idea because it's obvious. And if you're going to go down this road and build this startup, you have to explain why all the other startups that tried to do this before have failed and why your version is different and won't fall into that tar pit and won't fail. And I often wonder, like, like the Rails for JavaScript seems like such an obvious idea. People have tried to build it. And I wonder if it is a tar pit idea and people don't have a good explanation for why all the other ones have failed. And that is where this fear from, I don't want to build Rails for JavaScript because I have looked at all these other frameworks before and they've all failed and I can't explain why they've failed. And so I'm going to avoid it and focus on the things that I know front-end developers like and not talk about cohesion, but then talk about things like composition.
Interesting. Yeah, that's kind of an interesting, and I've had a lot of conversations with this, like as I've been going to these conferences the last few months about this, because I've just been thinking a lot about it. So what you're talking about is kind of like, why isn't there a more cohesive front-end framework? Why isn't there a Rails or Laravel for JavaScript? And first, a lot of folks have pointed out to me that there are things like Adonis, which is like a more cohesive framework. I've never really used it. And Redwood is, we had Tom on to talk about Redwood, and it's definitely inspired by Rails, and they have a lot more of that kind of thing going on. Forms is another great benefit that falls out of these cohesive frameworks that I called out in the talk. And I think the Redwood team's actually working on some form abstractions that are pretty powerful out of the box. But that's a good question. I think again, I was the point of my talk really was like, yes, it could be true that like there's some reason it's a tar pit idea and it's just never going to work. Ryan Florence's explanation was like, there really is no JavaScript community. Like, why is there no Rails for JavaScript? His explanation is like, there's no JavaScript community. We're all here from like we're all like, immigrants from like other countries, and we ended up here, and we all have our like, we're from the Rails community, or from the PHP community, or whatever.
It's like
and so we all have our
little Italy, like
yeah,
little
exactly.
Rails.
Right, exactly. And so it's like a melting pot. And so we're never going to have someone, right? We're never going to have a framework like that. I think there's probably aspects of both of those that maybe are true. But then I also think that you might have been able to say the same thing about Rails in 2004.
Oh,
And
100%. The tar
so,
pit idea isn't that these
yeah,
things can't exist. It's
right.
that
You need to understand why.
they failed, and then that's
Yeah,
going to allow the thing to exist. Because if you're right,
right.
you're gonna like print money. You're
Right.
so
My thinking on this is that the success of Rails actually had a lot more to do with like DHH's leadership and persistence. I mean, he literally had to go on like a freaking religious crusade to get people. And he was fired up. He was in his 20s, everyone who knows DHH knows what his personality is like. And he had to put his foot in the ground and say like, the other thing that we've talked a lot about on Front End First is the importance of extracting abstractions, right? And
skin in the game.
skin in the game, and the framework being extracted from like a successful product, because the real decisions that you have to make in a business are going to shape those trade-offs that we're always making, which is kind of what a lot of this is about, the trade-off of flexibility and cohesion. So it could have just been like the right time and place, 2004, someone like DHH, a product like Basecamp, that led to the success of a cohesive framework. But again, my talk was more, I think, setting aside the historical explanation about why there hasn't been one yet, I do think that a lot of folks in the front end community have not even seen the cohesive side of API design from frameworks like that. So I wanted to share those. And maybe just, we swung the pendulum towards a lot of flexibility, and there's just some room for us to play with other things. And maybe it doesn't matter that you used to use Prisma and now you want to use Drizzle and all this, right?
Right.
Those things maybe mattered for certain people earlier on, when you were hitting those constraints or the scaling issues of like the monolithic, opinionated stacks. But yeah, especially now with server actions and server components, we actually have an opportunity, better than ever we ever have in React, at least, to make opinionated, cohesive abstractions that work in every React app, but don't offer the maximum flexibility. And what they get in return for that is this cohesion. You can imagine, a form data component server abstraction, server component abstraction that comes with a really nice testing story all bundled together. And that's kind of what I would love to see the front end community experiment with. And I love that, frameworks like Redwood are pushing forward on like that cohesive approach as well.
Yeah. Yep.
And then on the other side, I wanted to talk about, the success that React has had on the front end and the front end communities, what they've gotten right that I think the back end communities could learn from them. And, I think it's easy. We talked a lot about last week, like it's easy for folks in the back end to kind of like, I guess we both do this, but it's easy for back end folks to kind of poo-poo like the front end capabilities or why something like React took off. Is it for no reason? Is it because it's just fun to play with? Is there actually any benefit to it? And setting aside kind of like the kind of conversation from last week, I think there are design decisions that front end libraries and frameworks have made that actually make them a lot a much better DX in a lot of ways that there's no reason the backend frameworks couldn't learn from. So the first example is, this idea of no spooky action at a distance, which is something that React really embraces a lot and has also influenced, because it's such a principle of React, it has influenced the design of like the frameworks built around React, and even I would argue like the other frameworks built around other front end libraries like Ember and Vue and Svelte. We're doing some Rails consulting right now, and in Rails, and especially in frameworks, again, like 10 years ago, there's a lot of emphasis on things like auto loading and file convention in order to wire things up. So you have to know where to put files, and that establishes a convention for things just ending up in the right place. If you look at a React app today, that's not how it works. If you look at Next, for example, which was like popular for adding server-side, pre-rendering and, getting server-side data at request time with get server-side props. And then ultimately, I think like the expression of this would be like the Remix app, Remix. All of it is kind of in one file, right? You have like your action, your loader, and your component. And that's the equivalent of like your model view controller, loosely, maybe your controller and your view in Rails. But to understand like the flow from the request to what's happening and the response, whether you're loading or like making an action, Remix is like a great example of like co-location and like locality of behavior, right?
Mm-hmm.
And, when Rails came out, even just getting people to name their controllers the same was like a huge win, because people were doing their own thing and it was hard to trace everything. So I understand why the backend frameworks developed the way they did. But I do think this idea of locality of behavior is one of the things that makes React so much fun to work with, makes it easy to understand when you open up a React page or a file or a component in a code base you're not working with. What you have to keep in your head can just be really kept to that file. And a lot of the design of React around explicit one-way data flow, it encourages this. And I think this idea could, again, Rails, Laravel, backend frameworks could leverage this idea of locality behavior without sacrificing much of the cohesion that they have.
Interesting. Really interesting. How much, so my first question for you, how much in these backend frameworks, how much locality behavior do they need to adopt? Like, do you want to open one file and see the ERB template or the blade template, see the controller, see model code, or like we often talk about like pod file structure. So pod file structure would be, you have one folder, and in that folder you have like your post model, your post controller, and your post template. So they're all kind of right next to each other in your editor.
Yeah. I think pods format, which that name comes from Ember. Ember had a file system convention that was inspired by Rails. And so, if you were going to view the posts page, there would be, controllers post, views post, models post, and pods, which is just a way to group them by feature rather than type, would be like, something more like what we see in Remix or Next, where you have routes, post, and then you have your model.js or in your, view.js, your controller.js. Maybe your model lives outside the route hierarchy because it's really like a data level concern. But yes, I think pods would go a huge way to improve this. And I think pods format, like grouping by feature, slice of feature rather than type, embraces this principle. It's one expression of this principle of locality of behavior, and I think it makes it a lot easier to understand because there's just less you have to keep in your head when you're understanding how this thing gets requested, where the data come from, how does it get rendered to the screen, and then what happens when the user interacts with it.
As you're talking, what's actually super interesting is that if you take like Next and Remix and any of these front end frameworks, they all have some kind of magic. I mean, I use this term magic, but they have some magic as like the entry point where you have like file-based routing, and that defines the entry point into the route. But then once you're in the route, you're usually in one folder, and then there's no more implicit stuff. Everything you import is an explicit import. Multiple components can be defined in any file, usually in that one file. And so it's kind of like a nice, you're getting me to realize it's kind of like a nice little line where you have your kind of magical entry point and then they drop you off right there. And then everything inside there is explicit. So they're not really saying that implicit is better than explicit. They're making the line very clear. We're like Rails, well, this is really Ruby, but everything is a global, and then the autoloader decides basically when you access something, what file to load that global from. And it feels like there's a lot going on there. So anyway, you just
Yep.
yeah, you just made me realize that. So
That's great little summary. And I think yes, the locality of behavior doesn't really mean like you can't have cool like DSL APIs and stuff. But it's more like I can look at a file and squint and see everything I need to see. In Rails, you can configure lots of global stuff. And we went on that whole deep dive about why like Next, for example, doesn't want you to
yeah,
hook into global events because global config is the enemy of composition, right? This is kind of a different point. Composition does have some tension with cohesion and like it's like a smaller surface. API surface area is easier to use, but it's harder to extend, whatever. This is more just like I think that DHH could write a version of Rails. You could write a version of Rails that has all the same values of conceptual compression that DHH values that he thinks are important, but orient it more with this locality of behavior
not have to sacrifice
principle in mind,
not have to sacrifice
and not have to yes, exactly, and not have to sacrifice it. And I think it would make it easier instead of having to learn, and this is kind of like goes into my second point, but instead of having to learn all these conventions and keep a lot in your head, again, this locality of behavior, Carson Gross, who hosted BigSkyDevCon and who wrote HTMX, has a great article called Grug Developer, and he also has some articles about locality behavior, but he talks in the Grug about locality behavior too. It influenced HTMX, right? Point being, you look at your button and you see what's happening to it instead of looking at a different file and seeing where the event listener is being attached to. I think there's a lot of stuff in Rails like that just doesn't need to be. Like you kind of think it's easy to like, oh, let's configure every request that goes through and it's going to add an object to the context and I'm going to know it does it. So that we can just easily access the context everywhere that has this thing. But eventually you need to understand where that's coming from and it's not local anymore. And the more you do that, the more of the system you have to keep in your head. And I don't even think this is about like OOP versus functional, because a lot of time these conversations go there. You ask for a banana and you end up holding the whole tree. It's more of the forest. It's more just like, I think there's a lot of interesting ideas of how the front end community, the front end kind of first frameworks have really embraced locality of behavior and how it translates to a very fun and easier to understand developer experience. So that was kind of the first point I wanted to make.
Awesome. That's a really good point.
The second point, so that's kind of like no spooky action at a distance. The second point is kind of like an extension, and it was lexical scope. And it's an extension. It's kind of a more nuanced point, because if no spooky action at a distance is like let's actually have like locality of behavior be the first thing, and you look at a remix file that exports an action, exports a loader, and exports a component. We could say like that's very local behavior. It's the feature. We've also talked how we like that in frameworks like Remix. You're encouraged to think about the feature from the beginning. Whereas if you like scaffold out a new model in Rails and they give you like 5 different endpoints with all the files there, maybe that's not what I want for my UI. You know what I'm saying? I don't like that those opinions bleed out there. And so I like the feature-based approach. But even in Remix, even though that's local, there actually is some spooky action at a distance, right? Because in a Remix route, you're exporting an action, and now you have to use action data, or you have to write a form that submits. You export a loader, and how do you get the data from the loader to the component? You have to use loader data. So this is something that is a remix-ism that you have to understand as you learn it. Now look at React Server components and how does the data get in? It's literally lexical scope. Like you are using JavaScript lexical scope, which means it's scope that you can learn about from reading the source code, like from reading the program, you know. Use loader data is not lexical scope because I can't know what's coming back from it without looking at the definition of use loader data. But if I do let x equals 1 x plus plus and console.log x, I can, any JavaScript developer, anyone who knows JavaScript can trace what's happening to x at every step of the way. And that's how React Server components work. When you load data, you're loading it directly in scope. And when you pass it to a client component, you're passing it. And how do you know what's available to pass to the client to be rendered in the browser? It's in scope, in lexical scope. Compare that to something like Rails, where you have to set an instance variable and just know that it exists.
Yeah.
And a lot of interesting things fall out from this. As we've been working on this Rails app in our consulting project, we realized a lot of like the organization and trying to factor our code well and make it easy to understand and read, that involves a lot of play and change and understanding as you develop the things. And since we've been writing React apps, you can just F2 and rename something. If you can F2 and rename a method or a function or a variable because you're using tooling that understands JavaScript, and the only heuristic you need to understand data flow in your app is JavaScript lexical scope, then all of a sudden your TypeScript rename function or rename variable is like your way to refactor your app, which is pretty incredible.
You don't need, I mean, it's just amazing. You don't need special tooling. You can go to definition on a function and you're going to end up in the right spot, where if you're using like a big framework, you might need like their VS Code plugin to understand everything. So yeah.
So I think this like is something that I think this will come more and more into backend frameworks because the technologies that enable it, for example, Live View, which is the Phoenix, server side renderer, and like that thing can go fast. I mean, Elixir is like super fast. If you could tell a Phoenix developer they can stay in, Elixir land to write their UIs, would they? This goes back to our conversation about, the 60 frames a second, the immediate mode rendering stuff. I'm pretty sure they would. If they didn't need to switch into JavaScript, if there was a way to do it, it's just easier because you have all your methods, you have all your variables are in Elixir, and you can rely on the whole tooling and it's all the same program. You're writing one app. The idea of like setting an instance variable only exists because we're using different technologies on the front end and the back end in Rails. But that's not actually a meaningful boundary that is like a meaningful part, right, of the concerns of our code base, right? If you fetch the users and want to render a user table, the only reason you have to hand it off to an ERB template by setting an instance variable is because ERB is in like a different scope than your Ruby file, right? There's no benefit you're getting by like setting it, and it's not like this abstraction point that is meaningful. You're just doing that because you have to have some way to get the data from a .ruby file to a .erb file. See what I'm saying?
Yeah. I do see what you're saying. And I would say most Rails developers approach it like that. I mean, maybe there's some benefit in your template, like your actual ERB template is backed by a controller. Like you could make this argument there, so you can put methods on it and instance variables, and the template can just act like it can call any of those methods. It can call any of that stuff. So maybe,
but I think if you were, let's say we're working on a Rails app and we're working on some complex part of the model layer, and we end up extracting a new class, and we're deciding on what the interface is, what messages to pass. That's being driven by the complexity of this part of the system. And we're deciding, it actually makes sense to have a summarizer class right here, and to just have a form ask the summarizer to summarize it. And now the summarizer is going to have all these subclasses, and it's going to have different versions of summarizers that can create all these things. We are factoring the code based on the complexity of that part of the system, right?
Yeah.
and we're defining an interface so that we can, keep things that change together, right? And we can like keep knowledge out of other parts, because when we want to add a new summarizer, we only want to have to do it in one place, and the rest of the app can just like send a message that way. That's the domain driving the design of our objects.
Yes, yes.
And I don't think that, again, let me try this on you as the Remix example. Remix uses use loader data to get the data across. And then you might have some after the fact justification. Oh, it's good that we go through this thing. We go through this hook, this interface, because
it like automatically serializes
exactly.
and transfers across the boundary. That would be
exactly.
if I was going to make the argument, right?
Exactly. But if you had a technology like React Server Components that just let you take
that did the same
variable,
thing, that did the
yes.
same thing, but it appeared in your editor as just local scope. Yes.
Yes. You would never say, and maybe there comes a time where you say, you know what, going straight from here to here, from like our data layer to our UI, we're doing this in 10 components and there's too fragile. Every time we change anything, we have to make a change. So now we're going to introduce a new object, an abstraction, and think about what messages we want to send, right, in the OOP analogy,
Yep.
to like actually have some encapsulation, some separation of concerns. But the separation of concerns that are enforced by the separation of technology at the beginning, I think that's not a valuable thing at the start, right? The just like you wouldn't come up with some way to pass data from one Ruby class to another that's not calling a function. You wouldn't come up with the instance variable setting and accessing it. It goes back to this idea of like the spooky action at a distance. It's something you have to know about Rails. In Remix, yes. You have to know about loaders and actions and use loader data and use action data. And RSCs are pretty fascinating because of that local scope. Technologies like LiveView and Phoenix are the same thing because you're working with local scope. Same with Rails. A lot of the stimulus and the turbo stuff, you get to keep more things in Rails. And React, but I think the front end frameworks have really nailed this. And I think once you realize that you can write a program with fewer like artificial technological boundaries, and relying on things like lexical scope, and therefore things like your editor being able to rename a variable everywhere, you get a lot in terms of the feeling of being able to write one app, in terms of the refactoring ability, in terms of somebody else understanding everything that's going on who just knows JavaScript because they don't have to understand anything special about the system. I mean, in React, we like lexical scope so much we took our API endpoints and shoved them in there with server actions. How do you know what endpoints this component is going to possibly hit? It's a TypeScript import. You have to import them in TypeScript. In a normal app, you would look for strings in a fetch function or like a link in a href.
In a big normal app. No, seriously, in a big normal app, you would be done. I mean, you would just be done. You would keep all your old API endpoints around,
right?
Because
exactly.
all you need is a big app with a bunch of string concatenation.
Yeah. So I think this is a really fascinating thing, and I think it's a huge strength of front end frameworks that they rely as more and more as we're going forward on the power of the language, to have no spooky action at a distance, to enable powerful refactoring and easily understand what's happening on a feature level. And even someone who's experienced in Laravel or Rails coming into an existing app, there are so many layers, and this was like the same it was like this in Ember too, which just goes to show you it has nothing to do with the JavaScript versus PHP versus Ruby thing. It's an ethos that the creators have. It's a values that the framework authors have. In Ember, it was the same thing. Both in Ember and Rails, there's many places you can inject kind of new behavior that affects either the life cycle of a request, for example, like an adapter, or a middleware-ish kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
You can override classes somewhere else, so when you're using it, you have to understand, right? As opposed to just a modern React app, you can open a page and I can just go, like you said, go to definition, follow the imports, and know everything that's happening. It's extremely powerful using this explicit flow of data. And I remember, like, when we started, man, this was something that was hard for us to really swallow. It was not easily convinced that this was a better approach, that we didn't need conventions around everything, because we believed in conventions around, like, you should use a relational database. You should use a job system that knows about your relational database and knows about your mailer. And, like, you should use a conventional framework. Those conventions extended to things like data flow and file system location. But I think this was something that took us a while of playing with these front end frameworks, going deep in React, and now maybe doing some more backend work again in these old frameworks, the kind of traditional frameworks. The conventions really there don't really buy you a lot, and in fact, they even harm your understanding, as opposed to this explicit data flow, this reliance on lexical scope. So I don't know what you think about all that, but
Yeah. Dude, the lexical scope argument is beautiful. Is beautiful. I have worked on a bunch of React apps, and again, it's not about the frameworks and stuff.
mm-hmm.
I see people wanting to accomplish the conventional stuff, and they make Webpack plugins, and
Right.
then boom, you lose all that. So I do think there's
Right.
I think there's a lot of times too where I might just reach for a Webpack plugin. So I think there's like a lot of discipline that's needed to know not to do that, because sometimes it's just so easy for the job you're trying to do. I also want to make sure we don't, like, while I agree that, like, auto-loading conventions and stuff, and just you can reopen a class in Ruby and modify it, so you have like
Right.
one request that runs, and then halfway through it modifies another object, and then for the life cycle of your system the other object is doing this. Now we would look at that and we'd say, like, that's bad code or whatever, but I don't think, like, because you can do that, it means we should throw all conventions out the window. I do think, like,
Absolutely.
Ember had a bunch of conventions, and one of them was this idea of services.
Yes.
You can think of as basically, if you, as a React developer, they're like global contexts that just wrap the root of your app. So it's like not a context that's used in multiple places. It just wraps the root of your app. You probably have like an auth context in your app and a theme context, and all that stuff in Ember would be a service. And that was a convention I really liked.
Mm-hmm.
You have to know that the services folder exists and there's services in there. But I do felt like that might have lifted us up from like floor 0 to floor 1. So, and it does, it might get rid of like lexical scope, because I guess your framework would be bundling and creating that context tree. That would be like magic, or I guess it would be like what you would call spooky action at distance. But it would be a shame, I think, if the conclusion was to like never use things like that. I don't know. That's sort of my reaction. So
I think that's really good, and it does highlight that maybe there is some tension at some point. We never really had a hard time knowing where services came from in Ember, because you inject them into the component you need them with. So you just know at service theme, that's where to look if you're accessing this dot theme, it's going to come from services/theme, right? So I totally agree. I think it's great you point that out. I think having the conventions around concerns that normal app developers are going to run into is kind of what you're talking about. Things like global auth status of a current user, right?
yeah,
And having patterns for that. That's where like the cohesion comes from. And I think, again, it's almost like what I want to do is like remake Rails and just see how much I can pull on this like idea of no spooky action at a distance, explicit data flow, lexical scope, but still not and see how far you can push on that without giving up the benefits that you have from the conventions and the cohesions in the backend world. Because I think there's a lot of times where those went too far, basically. Like,
you
there's
said in
too
the
much
beginning,
magic.
Yeah, you said in the beginning of the episode, you said pendulum, and I think
Yes.
that resonates. That really
Yeah.
resonates with me, because there's a lot of things where I like it, but it shouldn't be everywhere. Yeah.
Right. So yeah, that was basically the idea of the talk, was just to get back-end people thinking about those really powerful aspects of front-end frameworks, and then to get the front-end people thinking about the powerful cohesive aspects of conventional backend frameworks. That's really kind of just the idea. And I'm excited to see, in the next 5 years or so, especially with on the front end, it's kind of our jam, right? Server components and server actions, I think, are going to enable a lot of cool stuff. Conventional solutions or frameworks might look very different than they do in the backend world because of the component, the React component, unit of abstraction that we have. But I also think the backend frameworks are going to change too with things like live view. I mean, it's pretty interesting. So that was really the talk. It was called High Floor, High Ceiling. And yeah, hopefully you learned a thing or two about it. And we'll definitely put a link in the description for the talk. I think it's still just part of the live stream. It's not like a standalone talk yet. I think they're working on it, but I'll put a link to the time code for that in case you want to watch it. So.
Cool. Spicy question for you. So you said that front end frameworks have like server components now, and that's the thing they'll push on for the next 5 years. And then back end frameworks have stimulus and live view. Between those two, which do you think raises both the floor and the ceiling? Like between the front end framework and the back end framework, and those are kind of the technologies that we're going over the next 5 years. How do you see the ceiling and the floor shifting versus both those?
Good question. It's a good question. I think, man, there's a lot here. It's like a whole other episode. I want to say that I think there's a lot of really talented people in like the React space who come from these frameworks, and they understand what's missing. And so I think it's going to be pretty incredible to see what they can do with it. I'm still like nervous to even make a prediction because like the testing story alone and the local services story alone for someone like Rails is so amazing. And I feel like if you can't make a new app with the database and write tests against different states, easily get your app into like a new user state, all these different states, like you are below on the floor level already.
That's
so I think that might take.
You're starting off in like the sewer.
You are, man. You are. And people like testing is so good and like having it local first. That's the other thing. We've just been in React. We've done so many like services for so long as ways to solve this, but the services just kind of move the complexity out. There's still all the complexity of wiring those together. They don't work locally. They usually don't have a good testing story. So I think that's going to take some time, but I do think we're going to see some awesome like form abstractions and hopefully database component abstractions. I think stuff like Clerk with auth is amazing, that you can just like drop a component in and get like sign in with Google Auth and sign in with Apple and it just updates. But I don't want to have to like pay for a service to start our new app. Like, so I'm hoping that we see like open source versions or frameworks that have built-in solutions that look a lot like that just take care of auth or all these other concerns. So I think the floor in certain ways will go up very fast in React. In other ways, it's still going to take a while. The back end frameworks, I don't know. I think I think if you would have asked me 3 or 4 years ago, I saw this demo of like live view with Phoenix, which is written with Elixir, which is a programming language that runs on the Erlang VM, which is used to like thread thousands of like telephone connections all over the world, and has like insane capabilities. Like being able, you think hot refresh in your Rails app is cool, or in your React app is cool. In Erlang, you can hot refresh like a running instance of your freaking program that's running on a thread somewhere in Australia. Like you have to be able to hot swap it because you can't take the phones down. It's incredible. Like the concurrency abilities of Erlang is amazing. And Jose Valim, the guy who wrote the Elixir programming language and created the programming language, came from the Rails community, knew what problems he had with the concurrency limitations of Ruby.
He wrote Devise.
He wrote Devise, the auth solution for Rails. But specifically, like the performance capabilities of Elixir is insane. And Phoenix is like the framework that is like the most popular Elixir backend framework. Anyways, all that to say, if you would have asked me this 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said, man, like I saw demos of like this Elixir Phoenix app re-rendering UIs using live view. Like I'm pretty sure I saw like 3D cubes being rendered at like 60 frames a second, all server side. I don't even know how it did it. But it was this idea of like keeping the, all in the server, the source of truth is there. And, what Ryan talked about, or we talked about last week with these network sensitive interactions, it felt like, well, networks are getting fast. Maybe there are no network sensitive interactions. Maybe everything is going to be fast enough because we all have fast internet that you don't need to split across these environments. You can keep everything in the back end. And that ceiling is just going to be way higher. And there's no question that it'd be simpler to just keep it all in the server near the source of truth, near a database if you could. So I think 3 or 4 years ago, I would have said, man, they're going to blow the ceiling up. But now you look at the turbo stuff. I don't really use like the new the new like Basecamp products. But I think the consensus is even folks who are huge fans of Basecamp and DHH and JSON free, which I definitely am, they just don't feel that good. Things like hey calendar, they don't feel that good. So I think high ceiling UIs, things like the Trello example back in the day, things like linear would be a modern one. I think they still require a lot of front end stuff. And so, yeah, I don't know how high the ceiling is going to be able to be pushed from the back end folks. It seems like in the last few years, it's been more about the ceiling's here. Let's see what we can do to make this as easy as possible. Something like HTMX is like a good way to do that. We're not trying to build 3D rendering objects in the browser or instant reactions. We don't care. We're not trying to worry about the network sensitive interactions. We're trying to just make it as easy as possible to build an app that's good enough. And it's going to be like the cost is going to come down so much, but we don't care about making linear or instant drop downs, all that stuff,
Gotcha. Yeah.
So I guess maybe that's not really a spicy answer, but I really think, I think there is a future where we have like the React server component framework that feels awesome. And it feels like you're using one technology and it gets you really far, but we got a lot of work to get there. So
Yeah. The testing thing is interesting because when you were talking there, I was kind of convinced that, well, all we need to do to lift the floor up is to just get some basic, like get that logging component, get the testing story right. And that's not in all the problems to solve. Like that feels like it's not hard because it's been solved before.
Agreed.
And not, you know what I'm saying? Yeah, I'm not.
Yes, I know.
I'm not trying to trivialize
exactly
it. I'm just saying there's like work we can copy from there. So it feels like lifting up that floor
is easier.
Pushing up a floor is a lot easier than pushing up a ceiling.
Yes, I think so.
Cool.
As long as you have the right people for it and
Yeah.
they have skin in the game and all the other stars align. But yes, I agree. Conceptually, it's a lot easier. And anyone out there who's making stuff for this or working on frameworks, I think if you're forced to write a test for this stuff, or you're providing a component of a framework, a feature like login or jobs or mailers, if you also force yourself to provide a way for the users of your framework to write a test for their code against it, that's a great little forcing function that says, I think that you got this right. If I can write a test, the cohesion, exactly. And if I can write a test for my app in a logged in state versus a logged out state, then I know the boundaries are correct, just like the boundaries of Rails are really good. You can still use ConvertKit or Amazon to send your emails, but they all use Action Mailer, the interface, and that interface is the power, that cohesion that allows it to interact with every other system, every other component in the system. So that's a good little like litmus test. Can I write a test using your thing to test my app in the two different states with and without, or whatever, using your feature? That's a great way to force yourself to have that high cohesion.
Nice. Love it. Absolutely love it. I think that's a great place to end, but absolutely love it.
All right, everyone. Thanks for listening. Love to hear from you guys. So if you want to reach out and ask a question or have something you'd like for us to talk about on the podcast, hit us up at FrontendFirstFM on Twitter. Otherwise, that's it for this week, and we'll talk to you next week.
See ya.
All right. Bye.